My gaze had fallen on Aisha's radiant form, and my heart began to waver. A longing welled up within me to reach out, to claim her, to let her beauty become part of me. Yet I knew I had to tell her that what she had done was far from right. It was that knowledge that made me hold back. I approached her slowly, my steps soft and deliberate. Though I moved closer, I did not lift her veil. Perhaps Aisha had been waiting for me. When she heard the sound of my approaching footsteps, she raised her veil herself, meeting my eyes. For a moment, I was mesmerized. Her luminous face was enough to make the world fade away. My heart ached to forget everything else and capture her lips with mine. But I steeled myself, turning away from temptation. I threw down the gift I had brought her, a mere token, now stripped of affection, and headed for the bathroom. Under the steady flow of the shower, I stood for what felt like an eternity, trying to reason with myself. This was necessary, I kept telling myself. Without it, perhaps our future wouldn't hold together. When I finally emerged, towel wrapped around me, I found Aisha standing in the room, a troubled look on her face. The moment she saw me, she moved closer. Her eyes locked onto the water droplets dripping from my hair, her fingers gently clasping my arm. The faint perfume she wore, mingled with the warmth of her breath, stirred something deep inside me. "What's wrong?" she asked in a tender voice. "Why are you ignoring me? Are you still upset?" Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and I could hardly bear to see them. For a moment, I wanted nothing more than to reach out, to soothe her pain. But then I wrenched my arm free. "Why should it matter to you, Aisha?" I said coldly. "You can do whatever you want. Just don't expect anything from me." I turned away, opening the wardrobe to pull out clothes, doing my best to ignore her presence, but she wouldn't let it go. She came closer, and before I knew it, her arms encircled my damp frame. A shiver ran through me, a spark like an electric current. I felt an intense heat, as if a volcano had erupted within me. Sweat beaded on my skin as I turned around to face her, my heart faltering once more. Her glowing face, her smooth forehead, her large dark eyes, and her full lips. It was as if beauty itself had stopped at her and refused to go any further. Her innocent expression only fanned the flames of my emotions. Gently, I stepped back, putting a small distance between us. "Your clothes will get ruined," I said softly. "Go and change. Get some rest. Don't pin your hopes on me. I can't fulfill any of your wishes." The words felt like shards of glass on my tongue, spoken with great difficulty. Only my heart knew the storm raging inside. She was my first and only love. Now, standing before me as my wife, she was begging me not to look away from her. It was anything but easy. With great effort, I averted my eyes, determined to hold firm. But at my words, she broke down, crying openly. "Don't be so cruel," she sobbed. "I know I've made mistakes. I've gone against you many times. But now I'm your wife. I've come here as your bride. Please, just for tonight, don't make me suffer like this." Suddenly, she folded her hands before me in supplication. The resolve I had tried so hard to muster wavered. I let the clothes I had taken from the wardrobe fall from my grasp and took her joined hands in mine. My heart betrayed me. Slowly, I led her to the bed and sat down in front of her. She began to trace her fingers across my chest, her gaze fixed on me. I tried one last time to reason with her. "Aisha," I said gently, "how many times have I told you?" But I could see the pleading in her eyes, the silent hope that I would give in, that I would stop trying to resist what we both felt. I couldn't bear the thought of someone else coming between Aisha and me. Time and again, she allowed that person to intrude into our relationship, no matter how often I tried to make her understand. My frustration finally boiled over, and I grabbed her by the arms, shaking her slightly. "Don't you see?" I said, my voice low but intense. "That person will destroy us. Why can't you understand?" For a moment, she seemed lost in her own thoughts, but my sudden movement startled her. She looked at me with a mix of surprise and something else, something that made my anger waver for a fleeting moment. Then, without warning, she leaned in and pressed her lips gently to my neck. Whatever distance there had been between us melted away in that instant. I swallowed hard, a lump forming in my throat. Struggling to regain control over my emotions, I said softly, "Aisha, are you listening to me?" My intention had been to continue explaining, to make her see reason, but Aisha was no longer in a state to hear me. She was adrift on a tide of her own emotions. Slowly, she traced her finger from my lips down to my neck, and then to my chest. I closed my eyes tightly, drawing in a deep breath, and allowed myself to let go. In that moment, the boundaries blurred, and I found myself giving in to her, letting her take the lead. It felt like a historic first, a wedding night where the wife, rather than the husband, initiated everything. Meanwhile, a different scenario unfolded in the university cafeteria. I stepped inside, scanning the room for Aisha, who hadn't been in sight for quite some time. My gut told me something was wrong. Aisha never wandered around campus without me. So where had she gone? The unease gnawed at me, and the moment I saw Ramiz, I hurried over. He always seemed to know everything that went on around here. "Where's Aisha?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. But Ramiz's response sent a wave of anger coursing through me. He smirked and said casually, "Where else would she be? She's with Samir at the back of the university." My heart skipped a beat, and a surge of heat flared in my chest. I knew exactly what he meant by the back of the university, the secluded area where students often sought privacy. It was well known, and not for wholesome reasons. My fists clenched at the thought. Samir had never sat well with me. No matter how many times I'd told Aisha to stay away from him, she always found herself drawn to him. And now, of all places, she was back there with him. I left the cafeteria without another word, my pace quickening as I made my way toward the rear of the campus. That part of the university was notorious, a small garden lined with tall, dense shrubs and a few hidden benches where students would linger. It was a spot that allowed for solitude, but everyone knew it also had a reputation. The very idea of Aisha being there filled me with dread. She was not just my love, she was my honor, my dignity. I couldn't allow her reputation or our relationship to be tarnished by the mere implication of impropriety. My steps grew faster as I entered the garden, my eyes darting around for any sign of her. And then I saw them. Aisha and Samir sitting together on a bench. Her hand rested lightly in his, and for a moment, I couldn't believe my eyes. I froze, my body stiff, and my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. How could she hold his hand? I had warned her so many times, told her to keep her distance, and yet, here she was. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, trying to rein in the anger threatening to explode. But each step I took toward them felt heavier than the last. When I reached them, Aisha jumped in surprise, clearly not expecting me. "Mumtaz, you're here?" she stammered, her voice tinged with guilt and confusion. I grabbed her arm firmly, pulling her to her feet. My anger was barely contained as I demanded, "What are you doing here?" As soon as he saw me, Samir let go of Aisha's hand, but my gaze was already locked on his face. He had a broad, smug smile that felt like an insult to my very existence. Why? I wondered. What makes him think he has the right? With deliberate insolence, Samir said, "Aisha can't spend time with anyone else, huh? She's just hanging out with us. Her friends." His tone was calculated to provoke. He slung his bag over his shoulder, standing up as if this were some casual affair. Aisha, avoiding my eyes, looked anywhere but at me. Around us, people had started watching, curious and wide-eyed. My voice must have risen without me realizing it. Their stares made me angrier. "Mumtaz, let's go. Everyone's watching," Aisha whispered, trying to calm me down. Her voice was so low I could barely hear her over the blood pounding in my ears. "Oh, now you care about what everyone's watching," I snapped. "But when you were sitting here, holding his hand in this part of the university, you thought that was perfectly fine? Did you think that was adding to your dignity?" I scolded her sharply and tears welled up in her eyes. "Listen to me, Mumtaz," she murmured. But I wasn't interested. "I'm misunderstanding, am I? What about the rest of the world? What are they supposed to think?" I asked. "What were you even doing here?" Samir was clearly enjoying himself, standing there with that infuriating smile. "No need to get so worked up," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound calm and condescending. "It's not like we did anything. I only held her hand." His words were a match to my already burning anger. I released Aisha's hand and grabbed Samir by the collar. "What are you trying to say?" I growled. "Aisha is mine, and everyone knows that." My anger was hitting its peak, and I barely kept myself from shouting in his face. Samir, however, was undeterred. "Oh, Aisha's yours?" he said, laughing. "Then why was she here with me? Don't you get it? She follows me around. Sure, she's too scared to say it, but she likes me more than she likes you. I mean, just look at me. I'm stronger, I'm better looking, and I've got more money. Admit it, she'd rather be with me." He grinned as he spoke, his tone mocking. I couldn't hold back any longer. My fist collided with his face, wiping the smirk off his lips. Aisha cried out and stepped in between us, trying to defuse the situation. She shoved Samir away, her voice breaking. "Just leave! Get out of here!" she said. Samir, still grinning slightly, walked off with large, deliberate strides. Aisha placed her hand on my arm, but I shook it off angrily. "Don't touch me," I snapped. "Go hold his hand. Cling to his neck if you want." I pushed past her and started walking away, my mind seething with frustration. "Mumtaz, wait," she pleaded. "At least hear me out. There's more to this than you think." I stopped for a moment but didn't turn around. "I don't need to know anything else, Aisha. Whatever reason you came here, it doesn't matter. You've hurt me deeply, and you have no idea what people are saying about you." My voice was harsh, but I didn't care. "Take a good look around. Look at the kind of people who hang out here. How could you not know that everyone's watching you? Back in the cafeteria, those friends of Samir's, they were laughing at your character." I glanced back at her one last time, her tearful eyes meeting mine, and then I walked away, leaving her standing there. As I stormed off, Aisha called after me. "Mumtaz, please! It's not what you think. You have it all wrong." I ignored her, my thoughts racing. Then she added something that made me slow down just enough to listen. "My phone," she said desperately. "I couldn't find my phone. I was searching for it when Zubair told me Samir had it. That's the only reason I went to him. I didn't even know he'd taken it. He just handed it back now, right before you showed up. I only went to get my phone. I wasn't doing anything wrong." I stopped, turned, and glared at her. "If that was the case, why didn't you tell me?" I demanded. "I would have handled it. I would have confronted him, gotten your phone back, and filed a complaint against him. But no, you decided to handle everything on your own. You thought you didn't need me." The words spilled out, bitter and sharp. She tried to explain further, but I cut her off. "Don't bother, Aisha. What's done is done. You've already shown me where I stand." With that, I walked away, leaving her behind with tears streaming down her face. Walking briskly, I reached my motorcycle, my patience worn thin. I had no intention of attending any more classes that day. Aisha's voice called after me, a trace of pleading in her tone. "Mumtaz, where are you going? We still have more classes left. Please don't leave," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But my anger had reached its peak. The image of Aisha sitting on that bench with Samir still burned in my mind. I couldn't stand the thought of her being anywhere near Samir, let alone on that secluded bench. Even the shadow of Aisha close to Samir was unbearable for me. I told myself that this time Samir wouldn't get away with it. He always pulled stunts like this, deliberately trying to draw Aisha toward him. But what infuriated me more was that Aisha, no longer a naive child, kept falling into his traps. Why did she keep giving him the opportunity? That was what truly angered me. I resolved not to let her off so easily this time. Perhaps if I kept my distance and let her feel the consequences of her actions, she would think twice before making the same mistake again. With these thoughts weighing heavily on my mind, I left the university without another word and headed home. When I walked into the house earlier than usual, my mother looked surprised. "You're home early today. Is everything all right?" she asked. But I didn't reply. Instead, I headed straight to my room, locked the door, and threw my bag under the bed. I set my phone aside and flopped down on the mattress, face down. The more I thought about Aisha and Samir, the more my head throbbed. This wasn't the first time Samir had come between us, and I doubted it would be the last. It had been 2 years since we started at the university, and during that time, he had caused countless arguments between me and Aisha. Somehow he always managed to insert himself into our lives, and no matter how many warnings I gave Aisha, She never seemed to fully grasp the situation. As I lay there, my frustration boiling over, I began considering ways to deal with Samir once and for all. I was still lost in thought when my phone started vibrating. I ignored it at first, thinking it was Aisha trying to reach out, but the messages kept coming in rapid succession, demanding my attention. Finally, I picked up the phone and the screen lit up with messages from the university's group chat. It was a group shared by a large number of students, a place where updates about the university were often posted. I hesitated for a moment before opening the group. The moment I did, my stomach dropped. There they were, photos of Aisha scattered across the group chat. I didn't recognize the number that had shared them. These weren't just any photos. They were personal, everyday pictures. Aisha without a dupatta, sitting on the stairs or lying on her bed, images she had casually taken and sent to me in the past. She'd always had a habit of snapping such photos and sending them my way, despite my repeated warnings. I'd told her many times not to keep those pictures on her phone and certainly not to take them in the first place. But she had brushed off my concerns, thinking it wasn't a big deal. Now those private moments were out in the open, exposed to everyone in the group. The comments flooding in under the photos made my blood boil. People commented on her clothes, her figure. Some remarks were so crude that I could feel my ears burning. They were laughing at her, mocking her, and by extension, me. My pride, my honor, couldn't tolerate it. Furious, I dialed Aisha's number. She answered immediately, her voice choked with tears. "Mumtaz," she sobbed. "It's Samir. He did this. He took my phone. I don't know how he knew the password, but he took all my photos, sent them to himself, and started sharing them in the group from a new number. I don't know where else he sent them." She was crying uncontrollably, panicking. But instead of feeling sympathy, my anger only grew. "Didn't I tell you not to act like a heroine all the time?" I snapped. "If I had been in your place, I would have dealt with him directly. I would have gone to the principal's office and reported him. But no, you had to handle it all on your own, and look where that's gotten you." Aisha's crying intensified, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Her choices, her unwillingness to listen to my warnings, had led us here. It was a mess I didn't know how to untangle, and at that moment, I couldn't see a way forward. Now that the photos were already in the university group chat, I realized lodging a complaint with the principal wouldn't accomplish much. We had no solid proof that Samir had taken Aisha's phone. He would simply deny it. The number from which the images had been shared was untraceable, and hundreds of students had already seen them. Half the university had caught a glimpse of those private, domestic photos, pictures of Aisha sitting on stairs, lying in bed without her dupatta, images she had casually sent to me before. She had never seen the harm in it, despite my warnings, and now those personal moments were public. I wanted to throw my phone against the wall in frustration. "Well, sit there and keep crying," I muttered. Aisha's trembling voice interrupted my thoughts. "Please come back to the university," she begged. "I'm so worried. If my family finds out, it'll be a disaster. You know how conservative they are. They'll make me quit my studies. Everything will be ruined." Her voice cracked with desperation, and despite my anger, I couldn't ignore her distress. She was my love, my honor, and the fact that her images had been spread around like this felt like a slap to my pride. For a moment, I considered what to do next. Finally, I grabbed my motorcycle keys again and stormed out of the house. My mother called after me, her voice tinged with concern, but I was already gone. Revving the bike's engine, I sped off toward the university. My mind raced as I navigated through the streets. By the time I reached campus, everyone's eyes were on me. Whispers and knowing glances followed me through the corridors. It wasn't hard to see why. Most of them knew Aisha and I were close friends, practically inseparable. Now I was the guy everyone had something to say about. Before I could reach Aisha, a group of guys blocked my path. "Hey man," one of them called out with a grin. "Your friend Aisha, huh? She's something else. Always wears that big shawl, never shows anything. But those pictures, man, what a surprise. Didn't know she was that hot." Another added with a smirk, "Have you gotten physical with her yet?" Their vulgar remarks sent a surge of anger through me. Without thinking, I grabbed one of them and hit him hard. The others pulled me back as a crowd began to gather. Zubair, a mutual friend, stepped in and separated us. "Stop it," he said firmly. "You'll just make it worse. More drama will only stain her reputation further. People will forget this eventually, but if you keep this up, it'll never end." Zubair's words hit home. He was right. Escalating the situation wouldn't help Aisha. She needed someone to calm the storm, not add fuel to it. I took a deep breath and headed straight for the back corner of the campus, where Aisha had been sitting. I found her there, hunched over, sobbing uncontrollably. Natasha, a close friend of ours, was beside her, trying in vain to comfort her. The moment Aisha saw me, she threw her arms around me, clinging to me as she cried. "Do something," she pleaded. "Please fix this." I took a deep breath and gently pulled her away. "How can I fix it now?" I said, exasperated. "Those pictures could be on anyone's phone by now. The best I can do is talk to the administration and have them removed from the group." "Don't worry, I'll figure something out." My initial intention had been to scold Aisha for her carelessness, but seeing her in such a broken state made me hold back. I had to focus on solving the problem first. Together, we went to a senior professor we trusted and explained everything. We had no evidence against Samir, but we hoped that at least the photos could be deleted from the group. The professor agreed to help and contacted the group's administrator. The images were removed, and the number used to post them was blocked. However, we still couldn't prove who was behind it. We strongly suspected Samir, but we had no way to confirm it. Afterward, I turned to Aisha and warned her, "Stay away from him from now on, and for God's sake, stop keeping those pictures on your phone." Aisha nodded, clearly shaken by the ordeal. From that point on, she kept her distance from Samir and was far more cautious. Still, the damage had been done. The gossip in the university didn't fade away quickly. Everywhere we went, there were whispers, smirks, and cutting remarks. Aisha barely lifted her eyes from the ground anymore. She avoided meeting anyone's gaze, her confidence shattered. Despite the ongoing chatter, we managed to get through our final year. By the time we graduated, the scandal had mostly died down, though it left a mark on both of us. After finishing our studies, I found myself struggling to secure a job. Nothing came easy, but I kept at it, determined to move on from the tumultuous events that had marked our last year in university. While Aisha's family was busy searching for a marriage proposal for her, I couldn't sit idle. As soon as I secured my job, I formally sent a proposal to her family. My mother carried our proposal to Aisha's home, and soon the engagement was finalized. The two of us were set to be married, and I thought everything would finally fall into place. But then, one thoughtless mistake on Aisha's part unraveled everything. After finishing work one day, I arrived home. My mother brought me a cup of tea and reminded me that we needed to head to the market for wedding shopping. With just 20 days left until the wedding, we had to make every detail perfect. Aisha's preferences were at the top of my mother's mind. She wanted me to send pictures of the jewelry set to Aisha to make sure it was something she'd like. When we reached the market, I realized I'd left my phone in the car. I quickly went to the parking lot to grab it, but as I approached my car, my eyes landed on something that made me freeze in disbelief. Just 4 cars down, by the 5th vehicle, Aisha was standing with Samir. The two of them were talking. My mind reeled at the sight. This was the man whose actions had humiliated her a year ago, the man whose involvement had brought her so much pain and disgrace. How could she be standing there having a conversation with him? A million questions raced through my mind, and anger rose in my chest. I retrieved my phone and called her immediately. "Where are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She replied casually, "Oh, my friends invited me out. We're just having a small get-together before the wedding." She mentioned nothing about Samir, nor that she was standing with him outside the mall. I watched her end the call and place the phone back in her bag. She then got into Samir's car and left. The sight sent a wave of anger and confusion through me, so much so that I stumbled and hit a parked car as she drove away. When I returned to my mother, I made an excuse, saying I wasn't feeling well and that we should go home. My mother, worried, asked what was wrong. I mumbled something about a headache and locked myself in my room as soon as we reached home. Late that night, Aisha called several times, but I refused to answer. I felt like a kite cut loose, drifting aimlessly, my thoughts tangled in what I had witnessed. Why had she met Samir? What possible reason could she have? Did they still have some connection? These questions gnawed at me, leaving me restless and angry. I avoided her calls all night. The next morning, she showed up at my office. My assistant informed me that Aisha was here to see me. Reluctantly, I went to her, not wanting to create a scene at work. The moment she saw me, she began to plead, her voice trembling with worry. "Why haven't you been answering my calls, Mumtaz? I've been so worried." She moved closer, but I stepped back, shaking my head. "Don't stage this charade of love in front of me. If you cared, you wouldn't have lied to me. You wouldn't be riding in someone else's car after sneaking around behind my back." My voice was sharp and my words clearly stung. Her face turned pale and her hands trembled as she reached out, trying to hold mine. "Please listen to me, Mumtaz. I'll explain everything," she said, her voice cracking. But I had already made up my mind. I shook my head and turned to leave. "I've seen enough. I don't need to hear anything else." Desperation crept into her voice as she grabbed my arm. "It wasn't what you think," she said, her voice breaking. "Samir called me. He told me he still had more pictures on his phone, ones he hadn't shared before. He said if I didn't meet him, he'd release them right before the wedding. I didn't know what else to do. I was scared, Mumtaz. That's why I went to meet him. I didn't tell you because I was afraid you'd get angry, or worse, that it would ruin everything." Her words spilled out quickly, her fear evident. Hearing this explanation stunned me. I stared at her, trying to process what she had just said. If what she was saying was true, it explained why she had been so evasive. But it also left me torn between sympathy for her fear and anger over her decision to meet Samir. Aisha began her confession with trembling words. "I had taken some pictures of myself, ones that I intended only for you. But I never sent them because I didn't feel right about it. They weren't meant for anyone else to see. I made them only for you." Her voice was frail, as if each sentence carried the weight of her guilt. When Samir threatened to make those pictures public, I was terrified. That's the only reason I went to meet him. But I was too scared to tell you the truth. Her words landed like a blow. My mind spun as I imagined the extent of what could have happened. Samir had not only violated her trust by taking her photos, he was now using them to manipulate her. I couldn't believe that she'd gone to see him without telling me, that she'd let him intimidate her into such a vulnerable position. Aisha continued, "He started saying all these strange things about how much he hates you. He said he wanted revenge for all the times you humiliated him, and he intended to get it through me. He told me I should break off the engagement. If I didn't, he threatened to upload the pictures online for everyone to see. I begged him not to do it, but he wouldn't listen. Then he forced me into his car and drove us to a restaurant. I had no choice but to have dinner with him, hoping he'd give me the pictures back. But he never returned them. Afterward, I went straight home and I was so scared. I planned to tell you everything that night, but you weren't answering my calls." Hearing this, my anger erupted. I shouted at her, "Are you out of your mind? He was blackmailing you, and you still went to meet him? Did you ever consider what could have happened if he hadn't just taken you to dinner? What if he'd taken you somewhere far worse, done something horrible? What would you have done then?" My voice was rising, but I couldn't help it. Aisha's eyes filled with tears again, her fear and regret written all over her face. Trying to control my anger, I pressed her. "What about those pictures? What happened to them?" She shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely audible. I knew I had to act. Without another word, I grabbed her hand and drove to meet a family friend who worked in the police department. He had known my father for years and was someone I could trust. After hearing the full story, the officer called Samir to the station. Samir arrived looking uneasy. Under the police officer's stern gaze, he admitted that he had no intention of actually posting the pictures. He claimed he'd only used the threat to scare Aisha and exact revenge on me. Samir said he had heard about our engagement and, in his frustration, had done something foolish. Faced with the consequences, he apologized to both of us, insisting he'd never release the pictures and would never bother Aisha again. The police officer sternly warned him not to approach us again. Although they didn't press charges, the incident was enough to make Samir retreat. He left the station with a solemn promise to stay out of our lives. As we stood there, I felt a weight lift, at least for a moment. The immediate threat was gone, but the trust between Aisha and me had been shaken. I didn't say another word to her. I drove her home, dropped her off, and left without a single glance back. For the next 15 days, I avoided her entirely. I didn't call, didn't text. I focused on my work, my routines, anything to keep my mind off the turmoil she had caused. Though our wedding day approached, I still felt a simmering resentment. I was angry not just because of what happened, but because she hadn't trusted me enough to tell me the truth. The thought of Samir blackmailing her and her going along with it haunted me. If he had taken things even a step further, I would never have forgiven myself for not being there to protect her. I felt betrayed, and I wanted her to understand the weight of her decisions. When the wedding day finally arrived, my emotions were a tangled mess. On the one hand, I loved her. I had loved her through everything, even through all the pain and confusion. But on the other hand, I couldn't shake my anger. She needed to know that her actions had consequences, that trust in a relationship is everything. I decided to make her wait, letting her sit in the bridal room for hours before I finally showed up. She had been expecting me long before, but I wanted her to feel the weight of that time alone. When I finally entered the room, I had no intention of forgiving her so easily. She looked at me, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. I stayed cold and distant, determined not to let her off the hook, but as the minutes passed, I couldn't ignore the love I still felt. Her presence, her quiet tears, her gentle demeanor, it all pulled me in. Aisha walked closer, her movements slow and deliberate. She came so close that her presence became impossible to deny. Leaning in, she whispered softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Please forgive me, Mumtaz. From now on, no one will come between us. I'll never let anyone get so close again." Her words, filled with love and desperation, struck a chord deep inside me. I could feel her sincerity, her regret, and her desire to make things right. Without saying a word, I reached for her hands and gently pressed my lips to the back of them. "Promise me," I said quietly, "that you'll never keep anything from me again." Aisha nodded solemnly, her tears glistening as she gave her word. I knew she meant it, and in that moment, I decided to let go of my anger. As she leaned her head against my chest, I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close. The tension between us began to dissolve, replaced by a renewed sense of understanding. Slowly, the night slipped by, and I realized that a beautiful future was waiting for us. One built on trust, love, and the promise that we'd face everything together.